Well, back with Mel again, thousands of miles apart, and we're still talking about the dome. We have an awful lot yet to unpack. This time, you're going to actually look at who is responsible for building the dome. And we've always thought it was al-Malik. I always thought it was al-Malik. He ruled from 680 to or 685 to 705 up there in Damascus, build the dome in 691, 692. That's what we've always been told. You're going to put some questions concerning that. And then you're going to be looking at the shape of the dome as well, how the shape has changed over the centuries. Oh, this sounds great. Over to you, Mel. Tell us what you found.
Okay, so let's just share my slides with you first. Okay, so what's coming up is we're going to see evidence that people believed Umar built the Dome of the Rock, that there were originally different inscriptions in the Dome of the Rock, and we're going to see images of how different the building was at different times. Now, the significance of people believing that it was Umar that built the Dome of the Rock is not that we believe that Umar actually built the Dome of the Rock. It just goes to show that the inscription wasn't there. If there were an inscription saying that Abdul al-Malik or al-Mamun built the Dome of the Rock, then people wouldn't be going around thinking it was Umar, because it would be flatly contradicted by the existing inscriptions. Okay? So, start with this following curiosity. A.J. Juice says, from the early 1100s, we have the church of the Santo Sepelcro in Pisa called the Mosque of Umar. So this was a church that was built to mimic the building which was on the Temple Mount. Okay, and it's a strange one that they called the church the Mosque of Umar. The church is called Santo Sepelcro because it was designed as a smaller copy of Jesus Christ's burial place at the time under the rock of the Mosque of Umar. Now, I've no opinion about this, whether the tomb of Jesus was moved around over the centuries. That's probably controversial. But in any case, the design of Santo Sepelcro is an octagonal shape. It's an octagonal drum on an octagonal main building. But if it is supposed to be a miniature replica of the Dome of the Rock, one needs to wonder why it would sport an octagonal drum. Now, the drum is the inner part that you find in under the dome. And here's a bird's eye view of what it looks like today. As you can see on the left-hand side, it's clearly circular, and you can even see from the picture here, if you were to look above the rock, you can see it's clearly circular. But centuries ago, it wasn't circular, it was octagonal, which means that this was all reconstructed, which means the dome is new. It means that there's been dramatic changes to the Dome of the Rock over the centuries. Now, we also have these fascinating images from the 12th century. The Dome of the Rock is sometimes referred to as the Temple of Solomon at that time. A coin from al-Malik I is thought to show the city of Jerusalem around 1163 to 1174. You can see the image on the left. It lines up with the Holy Sepulchre, the Tower of David, and the Temple of Solomon. Now, if you look at where the arrow is pointing, it looks very different, doesn't it, from what the Dome of the Rock looks like today. It looks more like a tower. It's very difficult really to give a description of what it looks like, but it's the worst dome ever. If you compare it with the image to the right of the same left image, you can see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has a nice rounded dome, but this one doesn't. So there was something else there that was a very pointy roof, let's say, on it.
Let me just jump in here real quickly. So looking at the coin, on the left-hand side, the Church of the Sepulchre with the cross above it is on the right-hand side. The tower is in the middle, and then you're saying the Dome of the Rock is on the left-hand side of the coin there?
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can,
which is not rounded at all. Yeah.
No, and if you look really carefully, you can see what looks like a crescent moon on the very top.
Okay.
It's quite hard to make out, but it's there. So that's the one. So it's very different shape. And then on the reverse of a lead seal by Baldwin IV, 1183 AD, it shows the same symbolism. And again, this time it's the one on the far right is the Dome of the Rock. And you can probably make out the crescent moon, but you can see that it's not a dome. It's basically like a cone shape roof,
Almost
really.
like a teepee, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So very different. What does that tell us? Well, there's two independent pieces of solid evidence that it's indisputable that the dome that we see today is not original. It doesn't come from before the 12th century, clearly. So that's significant. And the fact is that the drum itself is octagonal. We're going to see more evidence of that. So far, what we're seeing is people are believing that Umar built it. We have images that show that there wasn't really a dome there. It was more like a cone or a teepee shape. So it's very damaging. Now, this image here is even better. I think it's much clearer. If you look at the coin, the image on the far right of the coin here, it's kind of like an acorn in this one. It's definitely not a dome in the proper sense of the term. And I think you can see the crescent moon there at the very top. It kind of reminds me of a telescope. What would you call that? Where you'd have it, a telescope looking out at space. What do you call those? Planetarium?
Planetarium, yeah.
It looks kind of like that. The same seal left.
It's a huge crescent at the top there.
Absolutely, yeah. So it would have been quite a dominant.
And it looks
symbol.
more conical. It looks much more conical than round, like it is today.
Yeah. So it's clearly, what we have today is very different from what existed at that time. So this is from Baldwin III, 1143 to 1163, so 12th century, and also it's the same seal used by John of Brienne in the 13th century. In the latter case, the Dome of the Rock is crowned with a crescent moon, as you can see. The design of these seals is not detailed enough to provide for clues other than the apparent cone shape of the cupola that rests on a tower-like main building that appears to be crowned by a ring of arcades. It's slightly taller than wide, so you can see that it's a much taller building. It's very different from what it is today. A priest called Johann from Wurzburg in Germany confirms the above decorations in the 1160s. He also delivers a detailed observation of the exterior and interior of the Dome of the Rock. He describes 4 doors with beautiful entrances. The most stunning mosaic work was at the upper part of the walls, where each of the 8 sides has 5 windows, except 4 on the sides with the doors, 36 in total. A more elevated, narrow inner wall is completely round with 12 windows. A.J. Juice goes on to say, let me put emphasis on its unclear description. The upper part of the walls were octagonal with 5 windows each, and a more elevated, narrow inner wall was round with 12 windows. This matches the modern appearance vaguely, but as you can see from the outer image, it's very different from what it is today. Okay, now here's the whopper from the same priest, Johann. He notes alternative, likely Crusader era inscriptions. Okay. He says that under the roof outside to the west, it says, eternal peace be to this house from the eternal Father. Blessed be the glory of the Lord from his holy place. To the south, it says, the house of the Lord is well founded upon a firm rock. Blessed are they that dwell in your house, forever and ever will they praise you. To the east, it says, truly the Lord is in that place, and I knew it not. In your house, Lord, all will say glory. And in the north, it says, the temple of the Lord is holy. It is God's culture. It is God's building. He doesn't mention anything about the inscriptions that we have today in Arabic. There are different mosaics. It's not clear exactly where this is meant to be. It says under the roof outside. Presume it's on the outer part of the building. But why does he not mention the inscriptions that we know of today? Surely if he took note of these inscriptions were obviously put there by the Crusaders, why did he not mention these other ones? The easiest explanation is because they didn't exist yet. So in the 1170s, Theodoricus, another German and possibly Johann's friend, visits Jerusalem about 10 years later. He also notes the inscriptions in almost identical detail, so that's good corroboration. He describes another mosaic work that seems to be a decoration of an internal structure, but yet not quite anything to confirm what exists today. There's no mention of the supposed Abdul al-Malik inscription. Instead, he reports this. The inscription reads, over the ark of the choir, my house is called the house of prayer, says the Lord. In it, whoever asks receives, whoever asks finds, and it will be open to him who knocks. Ask and be affected, seek and find. This is clearly a Christian inscription. It's, it's taking quotes, as you can see from the Gospels. In the upper circle, it says, hear, sir, the hymn and the prayer which your servant prays before you, my Lord, that your eyes may be open, your ears attentive over this house day and night. Look down, O Lord, from your sanctuary and from the highest habitation of heaven. And then there's various references to different locations around Israel. And he further notes a commemorative inscription regarding Jacob, but no reference to the al-Malik inscription, no reference to the 20-meter inscription that you see today. So I think this is really damning evidence. We also have Benjamin of Tudela, who is told that Umar built the Dome of the Rock. He visits the Temple Mount around 1171. And I won't read all of it, but basically in the midst of what he reports, he says, upon the site of the sanctuary, Umar bin al-Khattab erected an edifice with a very large and magnificent cupola, into which the Gentiles do not bring any image or effigy, but they merely come there to pray. So why does Benjamin, who's Jewish, why does he not know that there's an inscription to do with al-Malik or possibly al-Mamun? Why does he have the impression that it was Umar that built this? I would suggest that it's just evidence that the inscription didn't yet exist. I don't know if you want to comment on any of this.
Yeah, this is, I'm going to comment on all of these, but I think this one particularly is fascinating because look at even the gates, Abraham, David, Zion, and a gate of Gushpat. This is not Islamic at all. These are all Jewish. This is absolutely, I would suggest that he calls it the Templum Domini. That is a Latin name. So you've got to ask what's going on in the 12th century if this is not, doesn't look Islamic at all. Nothing that I can see is Islamic about this.
Yeah. Now, there's obviously, we have to take into account that the Crusaders have taken over Jerusalem. But even still, there's only two possibilities. Either the Crusaders took over the Temple Mount and found no inscriptions there, which would account for why there's no reference to them, or they did find them and destroy them. But what doesn't make sense is for these inscriptions to be there and no one notices them. No one says anything about them. No one reports them, which is very odd, especially when other inscriptions are reported, and yet these are passed over in silence.
Now, we're in the late 12th century, and still we don't see anything that what we have today. Go ahead.
Okay, so Ali is another visitor. He doesn't mention the inscriptions up high. A few years later, before the reconquest of Jerusalem by Saladin in 1187, Ali of Herat provides for substantially altered measurements. The Dome of the Rock in its current external state of architectural dimensions. This opens a window for upgrades to the extant structural appearance in the Dome of the Rock from between 1033 to 1187, most likely fall into the patronage of the Crusaders. Ali of Herat did not overlook artistic works elsewhere. For example, he describes how beneath the rock was enameled work all round, but not inscriptions or mosaics up high. Instead, Ali describes Quranic verses in gilded mosaics above the entrances, and there's a quote there, yet he doesn't mention the inscriptions that are meant to be above the arcades. So he only sees Quranic verses above the entrances, but not above the arcades. And he's clearly an Arabic speaker with a name like Ali. He could have read these, and how come he doesn't report them? I would suggest that this is pretty good evidence that these inscriptions still don't yet exist in the 12th century.
Just so I'm clear on this, you're saying that there are Quranic inscriptions now. We're talking about 1187, late 12th century, but they're not in the place they should be. They're over the domes, the doors.
Yeah, they're just above the entrances. So it's the first attempt to include Quranic verses. Okay. As I say, it's just a few years before the reconquest of Jerusalem. So presumably Muslims got some control back of this Dome of the Rock, and they start putting in these verses, and they're just in the entrances. But there's clearly no mention of any inscriptions above the arcades. I think this is really damning stuff. I'd like to hear Muslims tell me how is this possible that the 20-meter inscriptions above the arcades are not mentioned. That's, to me, is hard to fathom if they existed. I don't think they existed yet at this stage.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, just moving on. Imad ad-Din doesn't mention any sign of the inscriptions in the late 12th century. He was under the patronage of Saladin. He describes the interior of the Dome of the Rock, leaving the presence of mosaics and inscriptions out. And he basically says they had adorned it with images and statues. He's talking about the Crusaders, set up dwellings there for monks and made it the place for the gospel, which they venerated and exalted to the heights. Over the place of the Prophet's holy foot, they set an ornamented tabernacle with columns of marble, marking it as the place where the Messiah had set his foot, a holy and exalted place where flocks of animals, among which I saw species of pig, were carved in marble. Clearly, the Crusaders were having a bit of fun there by carving out sculptures of pigs, knowing well that the Muslims would not have been too happy with that. But what he leaves out is he doesn't mention anything about mosaics or inscriptions. Why not? So I think that's, again, just confirms that the absence of these. Late 13th century, still no mention of the mosaics or inscriptions. The Mamluk Az-Zahir Babers seems to have commissioned a restoration of the building and the external mosaics between 1260 1277. And the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, Muhammad ibn Kalaun, orders another restoration of the mosaics and adds his commemorative inscription in 1318. During his reign, the south wall of Al-Aqsa is also built or rebuilt, but there is still no extant description of mosaics and inscriptions. So again, it's pushing on further and further in time with no mention of the inscriptions. Then we have Ibn Taimiya, the 14th century. He says now, we've seen up to now that they believe that Umar was the one who built it. But here we have the alternative story being introduced. He says it was Abdul al-Malik who built a dome over the rock during his reign, following the civil war that broke out between him and Ibn az-Zubair. It is sometimes said that some people sought to perform the pilgrimage and joined Ibn al-Zubair, or that they used the pilgrimage as a pretext to join Ibn az-Zubair. What we're seeing here is the early elements of the standard Islamic narrative. A.J. Juice says, it is puzzling that Ibn Taimiya is so sure about the builder, given that an alleged interior inscription would say otherwise, in other words, al-Mamun. He does not say the dome, but a dome. Does he perhaps know that the Dome of the Rock as it stands before him is not the one that had originally been built? So I think that's quite telling that he says Abdul al-Malik built a dome over the rock. Now, going on, by erecting a structure over it, Abdul al-Malik increased the reverence for the rock and held it covered throughout the year so that growing numbers should flock to Beit al-Maqdis for pilgrimage and be deflected thereby from going to Ibn az-Zubair. People followed the religion of their king. It was since that time that veneration of the rock and Beit al-Maqdis assumed a proportion hitherto unknown among the believers. So what's interesting is up to Ibn Taimiya, there is no mention of any inscriptions. There's confusion about who built the Dome of the Rock. And then all of a sudden, matter-of-factly, Ibn Taimiya says, no, it was Abdul al-Malik that built the Dome of the Rock, not Umar. So this doesn't add up. There's something fishy in all of this, I would suggest. Why did people think it was Umar up to this point? And then suddenly he's suggesting now this Abdul al-Malik. I think this is a narrative that's been concocted to explain the origin of the building that's there. Again, in 1355, Ibn Battuta mentions interior ornaments, but no dedicatory inscriptions. So we're talking 14th century. We would expect the presence of dedicatory inscriptions. He mentions none of them, including al-Mamuns. So we're still getting very late. And then the Dome of the Rock is destroyed by fire, and yet no mosaics apparently needed to be repaired. In 1448, The roof of the dome is destroyed by a fire and restored by Sultan al-Malik as Zahir. One would again need to take the unlikely position that the mosaics and inscriptions, should they have existed, remained undamaged and needed no repairs after the fire. So if you imagine the roof underneath the dome would be over the arcades where the inscriptions are, it is hard to imagine that a fire would have knocked down the roof, and yes, somehow miraculously there was no fire damage to the mosaics and no physical damage with falling debris. That's what we're expected to believe. And this is on top of all of the other earthquakes and changes down through the centuries. And we have this image from the 1420s. You can see that this is a very different Dome of the Rock. There's an onion shape there on the top. And you'll notice also that underneath is a higher section than we see today. This is attributed to Hubert van Eyck. It's called The Three Marys at the Tomb, and it was painted sometime between 1410 and 1426. Okay, the modern balustrades around the main structure's roof are missing. Okay, so it's not quite the same as what you see today. Now, 1453, Abdul al-Malik is not mentioned in relation to the Dome of the Rock. Instead, it's Umar again, 1453. Around 1453, the Ottoman Sufi Sheikh Ahmed Yazi Oglu claims that Solomon's temple would be the site of the next prophet's heavenly ascension. The author points out that after the temple's destruction, the rock was rediscovered by the Caliph Umar. The lost signs were then reinstalled in their appointed places in Umayyad times during the construction of the Dome of the Rock and the Aqsa Mosque, and there's not a word about Abdul al-Malik. So it seems to be that they're still confused about who exactly built the Dome of the Rock. Is it Umar? Is it Abdul al-Malik? We have this from 1483. You can see clearly it's a very different roof on the Dome of the Rock. The first Western writer who provides a vague description of the Dome of the Rock after the Crusades is the German traveler Bernhard von Bradenbach. He visits the Dome of the Rock in 1483. He travels with Erhard Ruhwig, who is the designer of the book's fold-out woodcuts. In the detail of his account, the onion-shaped dome with its access hatch, as well as the octagonal drums, stand out. So you can see clearly that the Dome of the Rock still hasn't been built as it is today. Each side of the drum is supported by a strong pillar, 5 of which are visible and has 2 windows. The main building can otherwise be recognized as it stands today, although it has 6 openings per side. In the modern version, the cupola is held by 4 pillars and a circular drum, and the main building has 7 arched openings per side. So what we're looking at today is a very different drum and supporting structure from what it was in the 15th century, depicted here. Okay. 1483, Felix Fabry. Just a little later, the German Felix Fabry is able to visit the Dome of the Rock. That he does not see or recognize an Arab inscription is made clear by his attribution of the original structure to Umar and not to Abdul al-Malik. So why is that? It can only be because there is no inscription. I'm sure if he had asked anyone who built the Dome of the Rock, they would have been willing to say it's Abdul al-Malik or al-Mamun because they would have read the inscription. He doesn't need to speak Arabic to find that information. Okay, so I think that's very telling. And look how close it is to today's time. We're talking about the late 15th century, and there's still no clear indication that the inscription exists. Now, this one is from 1483. His description includes a magnificent mosaic decoration upon a gold ground on the upper half of the outer walls that are in the forms of trees, palms, and olive trees, and the figures of the cherubim. For they do not suffer other images or lifelike sculptures. The problem is that cherubim are not part of the modern mosaics. Now, this is on the outer walls, presumably the exterior of the Dome of the Rock. No such images exist today. So it's more evidence really that things have changed a lot over the centuries. Okay, now our last one for today. Late 15th century, no inscriptions are mentioned. Mosaic features were different. From the end of the 15th century, Mudshir ed-Din writes that the interior and exterior walls of the Dome of the Rock were decorated with colorful mosaics even up high. But like Fabry before, he neither gives us the builder nor the inscriptions. Around the same time, al-Samhudi claims that mosaics from the time of the Umayyads were made according to the picture of the tree of paradise and its palaces. He tells us enough that we can be sure that he does not talk about the present mosaics. There are no palaces in the mosaics, and no modern visitor would describe the extant mosaic's primary feature as colorful. So this is really good evidence that, yes, there were some mosaics in the 15th century, but the description given is very different from what it is today, which would indicate that everything that's there today is from later than the late 15th century. So that's it for today.
Well, you've taken us on quite a tour. I've written up 3 pages of notes trying to keep up with you, but this is good because you've brought it in chronology, a chronological order, one after another, and you're starting off with the 1100s, where we kind of ended off last time. So 1100s with the Santo Sepelcro in Pisa, which is octagonal, and yet the Dome of the Rock today is circular. Which is fascinating. Then you went to the 12th century and the coins. I thought those coins were fascinating because you had the 2 images of the Church of the Sepulchre with the cross, and then you had the dome with the crescent, putting the 2 most important buildings there in Jerusalem between that tower. And when you look at the dome there, it looks more like a teepee with the crescent on the top. In 1143, Baldwin III shows and talks about the dome, and it looks like a conical or tall, large crescent, but has his image of it that looks like a conical shape, not the dome that we see today. 1160, Johann, the Crusader inscription details inscriptions, but they do not the same inscriptions that we have today. In 1170s, Theodoricus, the German, mentions the same inscriptions that Johann had mentioned before. Those are not the inscriptions we have today. In fact, they're gospel references. Knock on the door, and these are what we know straight out of Christ, waiting to knock for us to knock on the door, and He will enter. Beautiful references. We used to sing. I used to sing it when I was a kid. What are they doing in an Islamic in structure? So obviously that's straight out of the gospel account. 1171, Benjamin of Tudela, mentioning that this was built by Umar. Curious, built by Umar. 1187, Ali of Herat tells us that there is refurbishments, but only tells us of the inscriptions, and none of them are Quranic. These are only above the door, not above where they're supposed to be. We're looking for those large inscriptions, the 20-foot across inscriptions that are above the arcade, the outer ambulatory. That you will not see. It's only above the doors. And then, Imam ad-Din says they're talking about statues, and the statues come straight out of the gospel account. Messiah's footprint, that has been replaced by Muhammad's footprint today, but that was the Messiah's footprint there in the 13th century. And also this image of pigs, which is, you think it may be a mockery of what the Muslims believed at that time. 1260, you have Az-Zahir Baibar, along with Kalaun, who talks about the refurbishment happening now we're getting into the 13th, going into the 14th century. And then you say, and this is interesting because you bring in Ibn Taimiya in the 14th century. Now, see, what do we know about Ibn Taimiya? A lot of us know about Ibn Taimiya, and my flags suddenly go up when you mention his name, because he is the one that radicalizes Islam. He is the one that has this real push to bring Islam back to its origins. And he is not at all liked. In fact, he is thrown into prison. He dies in prison because his message is not at all acceptable in that part of the world. Most people look at him as the great reformer without thinking, if he reformed much, then why didn't he have much of a following? His following comes much later, but he is the first one that mentions Abdul Malik's name. out of the blue, just says, oh, he is the builder. Well, I would suggest that maybe that is possible. Don't know what you think about it, but I think that may be a redaction onto Ibn Taimiya, because he is the one that is quoted much
That's true.
more,
Could be. Yeah.
by the Arabians who come much later. And they are the ones that probably quote Ibn Taimiya and maybe have given him that reference. So I would suggest that this is even much, much later, probably the 1700s. We'll get to that later. 1355, Ibn Battuta, no reference to any inscription. 1448, we're now into the 15th century. The dome was destroyed by fire and then repaired again. If you destroy the dome by fire, you brought a very good point. That would mean that also the ambulatories below it would also have been destroyed. No wonder we don't have anything from that early. But we're all now into the 15th century. Hubert van Eyck shows and pictures it. You showed a good picture of it. Here, I'm just going to show it again. Take a look at that picture. That is not the dome that we see today. And now we're getting into the mid 1400s, the mid 15th century. Yazıcıoğlu and also Bradenbach and also Felix Fabry, both are saying this, contradicting what Ibn Taimiya said a century or more earlier, that it was still built by Umar. Refers to the inscriptions and talks about the cherubim, but these are different mosaics. These are different than what we have in the dome today. We're not talking about the 15th century. We're talking almost 800 years later. And what you're suggesting, and I would agree with you, is that this is not the same dome we have today. It doesn't look like it on the pictures. It doesn't show it on the coins. It doesn't show it on the descriptions we're getting of it. It doesn't show it from the people who have gone there and actually talked about it and referred to it. It is not the dome we're talking about today. Well, okay, you've got me. You whetted my appetite. At some point, you're going to have to tell us when you think, or when A.J. Deuce thinks, the dome that we see today actually was created, because we're now into the 1400s, the 15th century, 800 years after Muhammad, 800 years, almost 800 years after al-Malik, and still we don't have the dome that supposedly he built in 691. We're now in 1483, and we still don't have his dome. Good stuff. Terrific stuff. People, listen, don't get upset with Mel and don't get upset with A.J. Diaz. They're just following the pictures. They're following the coins. They're following the descriptions. That is what we have to do as historians. Everything you have been told comes probably from the 1700s and the 1800s, redacted back to Ibn Taimiya in the 1300s. But be careful. Be careful. Don't go to rejections. Don't go to what Muslims are telling you today. Follow the evidence on the ground. It looks like, as we've been doing as sin sifters, we always put the evidence in there. We stick it in there. And what has Mel been doing today? He's sticking in the coins. He's sticking in the images. He's sticking it. And what's coming out? It's not the same dome. These are not the same image. This is not the same inscriptions. The fact that there are no references to inscriptions all the way up to the 1400s, 800 years later, and still the inscriptions are not the same as what we have today. Oh, they're all biblical. They are from the gospel. Yes, there are even pictures of pigs and cherubims. That is not on the dome today. So when did they get rid of these cherubims? When did they get rid of the pigs? When did they get rid of all the gospel accounts? And when did they bring in and introduce the inscriptions we see today, that 20-foot inscription that's above the octagonal arcade? When was that introduced? Well, Mel's going to come back, and he's going to give you that in the next following episodes, but not right away, because we still got to follow the route that history shows us. Mel, thanks so much. This has been fun. This has been great. We're changing an awful lot in just a few of these episodes from what we previously knew. All right, Mel, there in Europe, myself here in the United States. Good to be with you, folks. Do comment. The two of us, over and out.